CEO needs a fake date for his ex's engagement party, but she turns heads and steals the spotlight. Bryce had just begun to untangle a particularly stubborn acquisition deal when the door to his office swung open without a knock. The chaos of spreadsheets and silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of heels, deliberate and echoing, and then she walked in. The very woman he had buried under unfinished goodbyes and buried heartbeats. She looked like the kind of problem money couldn't fix. Draped in a green silk dress that clung like a second skin, lips painted with the kind of red that made you forget your own name. Of all the days, of all the outfits, she had chosen his favorite color. That wasn't coincidence. It was war. Bryce sat back in his chair, feigning composure, the tension in his jaw betraying him. He hadn't heard from her in months, years maybe. Time had blurred her absence into background noise, until now. Her voice rolled in like velvet laced with ice. "Still rescuing failing empires one desperate contract at a time?" she asked, pretending to admire the skyline behind him. Bryce didn't flinch. He stared at her with the same look he reserved for market crashes and courtroom betrayals. "What are you doing here, Celeste?" She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with mischief, as if she knew exactly how much this was costing him. "Thought you'd like to hear it from me," she said, with a coolness that wasn't earned. "I'm getting engaged." She let the words hang, sweet and sharp as a blade. She didn't wait for an invitation. With the same audacity that once drew him in and eventually tore them apart, Celeste crossed the room, her heels tapping out a rhythm of quiet menace. Bryce remained seated, but every nerve in his body braced like a man walking into a courtroom without a defense. She perched on the edge of his desk, casual and calculated, her fingers trailing up the front of his suit until they caught the edge of his tie. She twisted it between her fingers, not tight, just enough to make him acutely aware of how close she was. "To someone who knows what it means to commit," she said, her tone dressed in silk but sharp underneath. "We're hosting a little gathering. Naturally, you're welcome." Bryce said nothing, his jaw ticking as he tried to reclaim the air between them. She laughed softly, almost pitying. "Come on, Bryce. Has it really been 3 years, and you're still orbiting the same lonely routine? Still haven't found someone who can tolerate you past a shared cappuccino?" He exhaled a slow, guarded breath. "That's not your concern." "Oh, I beg to differ," she murmured, eyes narrowing, her grip still gentle but insistent on the silk knot at his throat. "I may have told a few people you'd turn up solo. Again, you always do. It's practically your brand now. Distant, impossible to reach, allergic to vulnerability." She paused, her lips curling into something between a smirk and a warning. "Unless, of course, you shock us all. Maybe bring someone. If you can find anyone willing to fake affection long enough to make it believable." The tie in her fingers tugged just slightly, and for the first time in years, Bryce had no answer. Bryce opened his mouth to speak, anything, even a retort, but the words stalled in his throat, drowned by the weight of her presence and the fire she had just lit in his mind. Before he could recover, Celeste leaned in, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her breath against his skin. She pressed a soft, deliberate kiss to his cheek, a gesture so brief yet piercing it disarmed him completely. "I figured," she whispered near his ear, her voice barely more than a breath. "You haven't felt something like that in quite a while." She pulled back with a slow, knowing smile, the kind that left echoes in a room long after she was gone. Her heels clicked against the floor as she made her way to the door with unhurried grace. Just before stepping out, she glanced over her shoulder. "See you at the party, Bryce. Try to loosen that grip on your solitude. Go live a little." And with that, she vanished down the hallway, leaving behind the scent of challenge and the silence of a man unraveling. The weight of Celeste's words still clung to him like damp air as Bryce wandered into Central Park just before dusk, his footsteps aimless but heavy, every mocking phrase from the day before unspooling in his head on a cruel loop. He didn't come looking for redemption or clarity, just distance. Somewhere between the rustling leaves and the chatter of tourists fading with the light, he sank onto a worn bench, letting the cold edge of the evening settle into his coat. Ahead of him, a small crowd had gathered around a cluster of street musicians, guitars, tambourines, and loud voices clashing together in messy harmony. But amid the laughter and chorus, a disruption caught his eye. A young woman had stepped forward earlier to sing. He hadn't seen her face then, only caught a glimpse of her slim frame and the guitar slung too low across her chest. Her voice had been soft, unsure maybe, and the others had drowned her out with exaggerated jeers and careless chuckles. Someone even snatched a few bills from her open case as she tried to speak. She hadn't fought back. She just drifted away, clutching the neck of her guitar like it was the only thing that hadn't betrayed her. Bryce watched as she slumped onto the edge of a nearby fountain not far from him, head bowed, dark curls falling over her face, fingers absently brushing the strings in slow, idle movements. Something in her silence struck him, an echo of everything he felt but never let show. He turned to her, drawn not by pity but something raw, something honest. "You have a voice," he said quietly, his tone gentle, free of judgment. She looked up startled, eyes widening like she hadn't expected anyone to speak, let alone offer kindness. "Really?" she asked, blinking at him through the low light like she wasn't sure if he was mocking her too. "Yeah," he replied, nodding once. "They just don't know it yet." Her lips parted slightly, as if tasting the idea of belief for the first time in a while. She pulled the guitar closer, still uncertain, still wary. "What's your name?" he asked. "Isla," she said barely above a whisper. "Bryce." They sat in silence for a beat, the sounds of the park folding around them, distant car horns, rustling wind, a couple's laughter nearby. Then he turned slightly toward her, hands resting loosely between his knees. "I have a strange idea," he said, his words slower now, cautious. "It's not dangerous, I promise. Just unconventional." Isla tilted her head, watching him closely, suspicious but curious. "I need a date," he continued, eyes not leaving hers. "Just for one night, a formal thing. You'd be doing me a big favor." She blinked, then gave a small laugh, not cruel like the others earlier, but genuinely surprised. "A date? Not romantic," he said quickly, then paused. "I mean, it could be fun. Good food, music, a room full of people pretending to matter. I need someone who doesn't care about any of that." She looked down at her scuffed boots, then back up at him, her expression unreadable. "And you thought I was the right kind of stranger for that?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but you look like someone who deserved a better night than the one you just had." "It's my ex's engagement party," Bryce said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than it had been all day. "She's expecting me to show up alone." Isla crossed her arms, her brow arching as she studied him. "So you want me to play the fairy tale stand-in?" He shook his head slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not in amusement, but something closer to hope, fragile and barely formed. "Not a fairy tale. Just a moment. And yes, I'd compensate you. Well, enough to ease things for a while. Maybe even more than that." Her eyes searched his face, trying to decipher his angle. "Why me?" she asked, her tone edging on suspicion. Bryce's gaze held hers, steady now, the defenses dropping one by one. "Because you don't belong to her world," he said almost to himself. "She'd never see you coming. She surrounds herself with reflections, people polished until they forget how to speak in their own voice. You, on the other hand, you stood up, sang your heart out, got knocked down, and didn't fold. You didn't chase their approval." Isla scoffed softly, looking away. "I sing for loose change. I don't belong at champagne tables or in rooms with crystal ceilings." "That's exactly why it'd work," he replied, the words landing with quiet certainty. "You'd outshine every person there without trying, and maybe for once I'd walk into a room and not feel like the one who lost." His voice faltered for half a beat, like he wasn't used to speaking from this place inside himself. "You'd be doing more than playing pretend. You'd be helping me remember that not everything real has to come in a perfect package." Though Isla had agreed, something in her eyes held back, a hesitation not rooted in fear, but in experience. People had made promises before. They'd offered change, chances, miracles, only to vanish when she reached out. So while she nodded and said yes, she did so with the quiet armor of someone who'd grown used to disappointment. Still, she showed up the next day at the same quiet bench in Central Park, just as they had agreed, clutching her guitar case and wrapped in the same worn jacket she always wore. When Bryce arrived, right on time, crisp in his usual understated elegance, she tilted her head at him, a brow raised. "So, where are you dragging me today?" she asked, half teasing, half guarded. He gave a faint smile, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Somewhere that might help you step into the role." She narrowed her eyes. "Define help." "A boutique," he said plainly. He didn't mention that he'd once brought Celeste there, years ago, when they were still in sync, before everything turned sharp and competitive. That memory stayed locked behind his silence. Isla, meanwhile, followed with slow, cautious steps, her expression unreadable as they stepped into the shop. The studio sparkled with soft whites and gold trims, but Isla seemed to shrink beneath the weight of it all, clearly uncomfortable among the racks of expensive fabrics and curated glamour. She tried on dress after dress, each one more polished than the last, but none of them sat right on her shoulders. Too much gloss, not enough soul. "This isn't me," she muttered at one point, fidgeting with a sleeve that glittered too much under the light. "I can pretend, sure, but I still want to look like myself when I do." Bryce didn't push. He watched her with the stillness of someone who understood the value of restraint. Eventually, the stylist brought out something quieter, a gown in deep green, graceful and simple, that didn't try too hard. Isla stepped into it and stood before the mirror, her reflection finally not fighting back. Still, before she let herself smile, she reached into her satchel and drew out a small necklace, silver with a tiny cracked stone in the center, and fastened it around her neck with slow fingers. "My father gave me this before he passed," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "It stays on, no matter the part I'm playing." Bryce met her gaze and gave a slow nod. "It stays." As they stepped out of the boutique into a city now lit with the first glimmers of evening, Isla's posture had shifted. Not entirely relaxed, but no longer braced for failure. She wasn't sold on the fantasy, not yet, but she was willing to walk in it for a night. And maybe, just maybe, Bryce had given her a reason to believe, if not in promises, then in the chance to rewrite what they meant. As they stepped out of the boutique and into the cool breath of the evening, Bryce glanced at his watch and suggested they grab dinner somewhere nearby. But Isla shook her head with a small smile, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You've spent enough today. Besides, I cook. Really well, actually." He arched a skeptical brow, the hint of a grin tugging at his lips. "Oh? Listen to you. Bragging already?" "Not bragging," she shot back, locking eyes with him. "Just speaking the truth." He chuckled and held up his hands in surrender. "All right, chef, lead the way." Her apartment was tucked above a quiet bookstore, the stairs creaking under their steps as they climbed. When she opened the door, he stepped into a space that was nothing like the polished world he usually occupied. But it felt real, warm, lived in. The lighting was soft, golden. A handful of framed photographs lined the walls, some in color, some black and white. Candid shots of Isla on small stages, her guitar slung across her body, her eyes closed in song. Tucked between them were posters of her favorite artists, Joni Mitchell, Tracy Chapman, Nina Simone, each placed like sacred keepsakes. The couch was worn but welcoming, the coffee table stacked with sketchbooks and half-burned candles. He stood still, taking it all in while she tossed her keys into a ceramic dish and slipped off her boots. "Make yourself at home," she said, already moving toward the tiny but tidy kitchen. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and pulled ingredients from her shelves with the rhythm of someone who did this often. Chopping, stirring, humming softly under her breath. Bryce eased into a seat by the counter, watching her. "You weren't kidding. You look like you've done this your whole life." "Pretty much," she said over her shoulder. "My dad taught me. Cooking was how we reset bad days." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "I wouldn't know. I've been spoiled, I guess. Hired help, takeout, reservations. I don't think I've touched a frying pan in years." Isla looked back at him, amused. "So, this is an educational experience for you." "I'm learning," he said, raising his hands as if in defense. "For instance, that garlic actually smells good when it's not burning." She laughed, shaking her head as she stirred the pan. "You're hopeless." "Entirely," he admitted, his smile softening into something quieter. There was something about watching her move, the way she took simple things, herbs, oil, rice, and made them feel like a ritual. He didn't need chandeliers or skyline views tonight. The warmth of her space, the way her laughter filled the corners of the room, the scent of something real cooking on the stove, it all made him feel more grounded than he had in years. As the food simmered and the room settled into a comfortable rhythm, Bryce realized he hadn't checked his phone once. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to. As the final bubbles of rice hissed gently under the lid, Isla removed the pot from the heat and scooped some onto two mismatched plates. She handed one to Bryce and sat across from him at the tiny dining table, waiting as he took the first bite. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable, eyebrows drawn in a way that made her sit up straighter. Her eyes narrowed, her voice tentative. "You hate it, don't you?" Bryce held up a hand, swallowing with a dramatic pause before cracking into a quiet laugh. No. On the contrary, I just wasn't ready for how good that was." Isla relaxed, grinning. "That's what I thought." The meal passed with ease, the conversation weaving naturally between teasing jabs and quiet planning. After the dishes were cleared, neither of them moved to leave or clean further. Instead, Isla led him into the adjacent room, where a low bed sat tucked beneath string lights and bookshelves. Without thinking too hard, they both lay on their backs side by side, eyes on the cracked ceiling that held constellations of past water stains and little glow-in-the-dark stars from another life. A long beat of silence passed between them, the kind that felt comfortable rather than strained. Then Bryce spoke, his voice softer than usual. "So tomorrow," Isla sighed, folding her arms behind her head. "We walk in like we've known each other forever, like we're madly in love and maybe just a little bored of everyone else in the room. And if anyone asks how we met," he prompted. "At a street show in the rain," she answered without missing a beat. "You heard me singing, came back the next night, and never stopped." He turned his head slightly to look at her, impressed. "You've thought this through." "I have to sell the fantasy, don't I?" she said with a half smile. Then quieter. "Besides, it's the closest I've been to that kind of story." Bryce let the quiet stretch again before he whispered, "It's strange. This, lying beside someone I just met, planning a make-believe life, it doesn't feel false." Isla didn't look at him, just kept her gaze on the ceiling, her voice low. "It doesn't, not yet." In the stillness of that room, filled with the faint scent of herbs and leftover rice, both of them knew they were rehearsing more than just a role. Isla moved through the ballroom like a quiet storm dressed in grace. The soft lighting caught the glint of the silver necklace resting at her collarbone, the one she'd fastened with care before leaving her apartment, its meaning woven deeper than any accessory in the room. Her hand rested gently on Bryce's arm, not just for show, but with a presence that spoke of trust, of a connection that, for reasons neither of them had named yet, felt startlingly real. As they crossed the floor, heads turned not because she demanded attention, but because she carried herself like someone who didn't need to. The rich green of her gown wrapped around her like poetry in motion, simple, untouched by trends, and that very lack of pretense made her luminous. Celeste noticed immediately. She had always had a way of sizing people up and peeling them down with a single glance, and tonight was no exception. Her eyes flicked over Isla with thinly veiled contempt, the corners of her lips curving into a smile meant to cut. "Quite the entrance," she drawled as they approached, her tone syrupy with condescension. "Is she your latest charity project, Bryce?" Before Bryce could speak, Isla met Celeste's gaze with an expression so poised it bordered on serene. She didn't shrink, didn't blink, she simply smiled, the kind of smile that women like Celeste mistook for naivety, but was actually crafted from experience and unshakable confidence. "I suppose if you count art as charity," Isla replied with a calm lilt, "then sure, I've been a lifelong case." She tilted her head slightly, not in submission, but in challenge, her fingers still looped through Bryce's with quiet certainty. Though something tells me you've always had trouble recognizing the value in anything that doesn't come with a designer tag. Celeste's laugh came brittle, hollow, but Isla had already turned back to Bryce, her eyes warm as if the encounter hadn't left the slightest bruise. He met her gaze and gave the smallest nod, proud, grateful, and maybe a little in awe. The room buzzed around them, but in that moment Isla was unmistakably the axis it all revolved around. Bryce guided Isla toward a quieter table near the edge of the room, away from the polished intensity of the main crowd. He pulled out her chair without a word, a simple gesture that felt oddly intimate amid the glitz. She sat, smoothing the fabric of her dress, her gaze catching on the flicker of candlelight reflected in a nearby window. Bryce took his seat beside her, and for a moment it was enough just to breathe. Then it came, Celeste's voice, too smooth, too loud, slicing through the room like the clink of glass breaking. "Isla, right?" she called out, her tone wrapped in mock sweetness. "Would you do us the honor of performing something? I hear you're a singer. Surely this is just the kind of crowd you love." The words fell like a trap, and Isla blinked, caught completely off guard. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for an impromptu performance in front of strangers, dripping in silk and scrutiny. Her spine stiffened, eyes darting toward Bryce. She leaned in slightly, her voice low. "This wasn't part of the deal." Bryce met her gaze, his expression calm but sincere. "You don't have to," he said gently, but then added, "But if you do, you'll show them exactly who you are, not what she wants them to see." There was no mic waiting, no applause queued up in anticipation, just a hush, curious and tinged with judgment as she stood slowly and walked forward. Her dress moved like smoke, and the lights caught the necklace at her throat. The one thing she wore not for show, but memory. She spoke briefly with the pianist, her voice nearly inaudible over the stir. The first chords whispered into the air, like a secret being shared. She started to sing. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't operatic or showy, but it wrapped around the room with an unexpected warmth. Every note carried depth, the kind that only comes from living. Her sound was raw in the best way, fragile at the edges but steady at the core. She wasn't like the others here. She didn't have their polish or pedigree, but she had something far more compelling. Truth. People turned, slowly at first. Conversations dimmed. Faces shifted from polite attention to something closer to awe. Even the staff paused. Bryce watched, hands folded, chest rising with something tight and proud. Celeste stood frozen, her smile strained, her fingers curled around her glass a bit too tightly. Isla didn't notice. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in melody. When the final note slipped into silence, it hung there for a moment, like the whole room had forgotten to breathe. And then, the applause. It started as a ripple, then swelled into something undeniable. Isla returned to her seat quietly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Bryce leaned toward her, voice low and sure. "You didn't just sing." She looked down, exhaling slowly. "I didn't think I could." He smiled, not wide, but real. "That's why they believed you." And in his eyes, there was no more pretending. The night had begun to peel away its glamour as Bryce and Isla walked slowly toward the car, the click of her heels softened by the drizzle now lacing the sidewalk. He hadn't said much since they left the ballroom, his steps measured, gaze distant. The applause, the stolen glances, the stunned silence, all of it looped quietly in his head, like a song that wouldn't end. Beside him, Ayla broke the silence, her voice light but laced with something more. "You know, I didn't think I'd make it past the first verse." Bryce gave a faint nod, but didn't reply. He was somewhere between replaying Celeste's expression and the way Isla had captivated the room without effort. The rain tapped gently on his shoulders, threading between them like a second presence, delicate and steady. When they reached the car, he opened the door for her, waited until she slid in, then circled around and took his seat behind the wheel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The windows fogged slightly, the city lights bleeding through like watercolor. The rhythm of the rain filled the space between them. Then, without turning to look at her, Bryce asked quietly, "Are you still pretending?" The question landed like a drop too heavy in a glass already full. Isla coughed unexpectedly, caught off guard, almost choking on her own breath. She turned slightly in her seat, eyes wide for a moment, the reality of the evening crashing into her all at once. "This was supposed to be a job," she said, barely more than a whisper, her fingers tightening in her lap. "One night, play the part, get paid." But she didn't say more. Instead, she looked out the window, watching the streaks of water slide across the glass like thoughts she couldn't catch in time. Bryce didn't push her. He just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead. And though no answer came, the silence between them now felt different, no longer filled with strangers or roles, but something real neither of them quite knew how to name. The car rolled to a gentle stop in front of her apartment, the engine ticking softly as the rain faded into a hush. Bryce didn't speak right away. The night had settled between them like a thick, unspoken truth, too delicate to disturb. Isla reached for the door handle, but paused when she felt his hand lightly touch her arm. Barely there, yet grounding. He stepped out first and walked her to the front door, where the old porch light cast a golden halo above them. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete and jasmine. Bryce looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing the way she looked outside the gown, outside the stage lights, outside everything they'd pretended to be. Slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a folded check, his fingers brushing hers as he placed it into her hand. She didn't unfold it, didn't glance at the figure. She just nodded once, eyes searching his with something close to gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of it." He stepped back as she opened the door, and for a second, he stood there watching her disappear inside, the soft click of the lock closing behind her. He turned to leave, taking a few steps toward his car, but each step felt heavier, as though something in him resisted the distance. He paused at the edge of the sidewalk, heart stumbling against his ribs. It wasn't confusion, it was clarity, and it terrified him. Without letting himself second guess, he turned back, walked up to the door again, raised his hand, knocked once. The door flew open almost instantly, as if she'd never really left, as if she'd been on the other side waiting. Her expression wasn't surprised, it was expectant, maybe even hopeful. He exhaled, lips parting around words that felt too big to hold back. "There's a gala next weekend, a real one. No games, no exes, just a night I think I'd regret if you weren't part of it." Her eyes searched his, her breath catching just slightly. A long pause stretched between them before she finally shook her head, slow, deliberate. "No gowns?" she asked, her mouth twitching at the corner. He laughed softly. "You can wear whatever you want." She leaned against the doorframe, that quiet, knowing spark in her eyes. "Then yeah, I'd like that." When the elevator doors slid open, Bryce turned, and for a moment, even the ambient chatter of the rooftop gala seemed to fall away. Isla stepped out beside him, dressed in a midnight blue gown that moved like ink in water, subtle in its elegance, but impossible to overlook. She had used part of the money he'd paid her to buy it, not to impress, but to feel like herself in a space that didn't welcome her kind easily. Her hair was swept back, lips tinted in a quiet shade of confidence. And though she wore no diamonds, she carried herself with something far rarer. Poise born from knowing exactly who she was. Bryce hadn't expected this. Not the grace, not the quiet command of a room that measured worth in surnames and silent power. But as they stepped forward, he leaned in and whispered, "You've turned heads." His voice held no amusement, only awe. All around them, subtle glances shifted into fixed stares, murmurs trailing behind polished smiles. Some guests whispered with tight smirks. Others simply blinked like they were seeing something they couldn't quite name. Isla walked beside him as though she hadn't noticed a thing, but Bryce noticed everything. The question landed like a gentle wave, but its undertone was sharp. "So how did you two meet?" a man in a tailored navy suit asked, swirling his drink as he leaned in with a curious smile. Bryce hesitated for half a second, just long enough for Isla to glance at him, expecting him to repeat what they had agreed upon. That he saw her singing in the park, that he came back, that they connected in a way neither could explain. Their story, the truth, or at least their version of it. But instead, he smiled lightly and said, "We were introduced through some mutual friends at a fundraiser downtown. Art event, I think." Isla blinked, the words hitting harder than she expected. She turned her face slightly to keep her reaction hidden, but inside it was like something slipped loose. The group around them nodded, appeased by the safe, polished answer. Of course. Fundraiser. Downtown. That made more sense to them. She stared ahead, lips tight, heart sinking, so he couldn't even say how they really met. Not here, not in front of them. Her fingers curled slightly against her palm. Bryce didn't notice, too caught in conversation as someone began talking about international investment portfolios. She leaned close to his ear, her voice calm but cold. "I need some air." And without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her heels quiet but sure on the marble floor, the weight of the lie pressing harder than any stare in that room. Isla stepped out onto the rooftop terrace, the cool night air brushing against her bare shoulders as she folded her arms tightly, more from emotion than the breeze. The murmur of conversation and laughter inside faded behind the glass, replaced by the distant hum of city streets below. She didn't expect him to follow, but of course he did. Bryce approached cautiously, his footsteps slower now, the weight of the evening finally settling in. "Isla, you didn't have to lie," she cut in, not turning around. Her voice was steady, but it trembled at the edges. "We rehearsed what to say. You knew that story mattered to me, but the second someone asked, you changed it, like the truth wasn't polished enough for this crowd." "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said quietly, hands at his sides, unsure what to do with them. "You didn't have to. I got the message loud and clear," she said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with frustration held back by pride. "You were ashamed of where you met me. Maybe not fully, maybe not consciously, but enough to rewrite it in front of people you cared about impressing." He opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the chance to explain. "I've spent too much of my life being almost accepted, almost respected, smiled at, then dismissed. And I told you before, I don't need another place where I have to twist myself just to fit in." Bryce's face tightened, regret already blooming behind his eyes. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I panicked. I didn't want to give them something to pick apart." "They already did," she said flatly. "But that's not what stung. It was knowing you helped them." He stepped forward slowly, but she stepped back, the space between them stretching like something final. "I can't be with someone who only stands beside me when it's easy," she whispered. "I need to belong, not just be tolerated when it's convenient." Bryce swallowed hard, words caught behind the knot rising in his throat. "So what now?" he asked, softer than before. "You go back in," she replied, already turning, "and I go back to where I can be myself." And just like that, she walked away, not with bitterness, but with the quiet dignity of someone choosing herself, fully and unapologetically.